Originally from Corry, Pennsylvania, Master Sergeant Timothy Wilkinson enlisted in the United States Air Force in 1981. After his initial tour at Chanute Air Force Base in Illinois, he volunteered for cross-training into the pararescue career field. On 3 October 1993, United States forces from Task Force Ranger in Mogadishu, Somalia, were on a mission to apprehend 2 leaders of the Somali National Alliance. Wilkinson and the rest of the Combat Search and Rescue Team were circling above the city in a Black Hawk helicopter when they were notified that Super 6-1, a Black Hawk providing cover for troops on the ground, had gone down after being hit by a rocket-propelled grenade. Within 8 minutes of the crash, Wilkinson conducted a fast rope insertion while under extremely heavy enemy fire. After locating Super 6-1, he repeatedly exposed himself to intense small arms fire and grenades to extract crew members from the wreckage and provide emergency medical treatment to the survivors. Despite sustaining injuries to the face and arm from shrapnel, Wilkinson responded to calls for a medic to help ground forces who had been inserted at the start of the operation and were now holed up across a major intersection. He ignored all concern for his own personal safety by crossing the 45-meter wide open area under intense fire to reach the injured soldiers. After learning that the exfiltration ground convoy had been forced to return to base after suffering extensive casualties attempting to reach the crash site, he broke cover to cross this open area again to secure and return with additional medical supplies to continue treatment. Wilkinson's actions saved multiple lives during the 15-hour firefight, exemplifying the pararescueman's motto, that others may live. For his actions, he was awarded the Air Force Cross and Purple Heart. In addition to the Battle of Mogadishu in Somalia, he also served in Operation Just Cause in Panama and Operation Uphold Democracy in Haiti. Wilkinson retired from active duty in September 2001. He currently resides near Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where he is the Joint Special Operations Command Personnel Recovery Branch Chief. Air Command and Staff College is proud to honor Master Sergeant Timothy Wilkinson as an Eagle.
Please join me in welcoming Master Sergeant Timothy Wilkinson being interviewed by Major Ryan Lemaire.
It's my distinct honor to be up on stage with you today.
Well, thank you, Ryan. And before we get started here, I wanted to take this opportunity to sincerely thank the Air Command and Staff College here for inviting me to participate in this event and for all the hospitality that they've shown here as we've been here. I'd also like to thank the other Eagles here and say what a privilege and an honor it has been to be a part of this with you. Thank you very much.
So I'd like to start our talk today by starting at the beginning. Can you describe what made you decide to join the Air Force?
I can indeed. So I'm going to school at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. I'm working on an undergraduate degree in electrical engineering. And after numerous math courses, applied differential equations, vectors and matrices, etc., and applying that to the electrical engineering world, it's not making a lot of sense to me. So I had a colleague of mine, a fellow student there, who had come out of the Air Force, worked in electronics in the Air Force, and was going through the electrical engineering program. And he said, hey, why don't you take a knee for a little bit, go into the Air Force, get into a electronics technology program there, get a little practical experience, do your 4 years, come back out and finish up your undergraduate degree. So that was my going-in plan. Went into a electronics discipline, missiles within the Air Force there. Arrived as a video show at Chanute Air Force Base, did my training there, ended up staying on as a pipeline instructor, taught electronics, and then taught missile systems integration there as well. At about 2.5 year mark, I ended up reading an article in Airman Magazine about two Vietnam-era pararescuemen, Bill Pitzenbarger and Dwayne Hackney. And at the back of it, there was an interview with Dwayne Hackney. And it showed a picture of Master Sergeant Hackney there at the Rescue Memorial there at Scott Air Force Base. And he's kneeling next to the memorial, and he's got a pair of grass clippers in his hands. And the question is, Master Sergeant Hackney, you're a Master Sergeant now, what are you doing weeds and seeds and clipping the grass around the memorial? And his response spoke to me. And what he said, in paraphrasing here, was, this is a tribute to my teammates, my flight mates. He said, if I shouldn't trim the grass around this memorial and upkeep it, who should? And so with that, I thought to myself, those are the kind of people I want to be around. So I began to look at that, did some research, and found out, hey, what is it going to take to cross-train to be a pararescueman? And is it even possible for me to be able to do something like that? And from there I went forward and was able to get into training, and luckily made it through training, and the rest is history.
So after the training, you were assigned to a unit in Alaska and then onto a special tactics squadron at Fort Bragg. Leading up to your unit's involvement in Somalia, can you describe your awareness of the political situation there and the type of training you went through before?
Well, going into this in 93, most of us had been following the dynamics in the Horn of Africa at that time through 92, the famine, the political struggle that was taking place there. So I had an awareness of that as we were watching CNN, which was the only news broadcast at that time, really. It was ongoing all the time. So we were also following some of the events through 92, June of 92. There was a massacre of, I think, somewhere between 24 and 35 Pakistanis there in Mogadishu. And on June 6th, I believe it was, the UN passed a resolution, I think it was 837, that basically declared Aidid as the responsible party, and his clan, the Abrgida clan, the Somali National Alliance, is responsible for that massacre. And he was to be brought to justice. So up to that point, there was U.S. presence already there. We had come ashore in December of 92. The Marines had turned it over to the UN. The UN then was running the operation, but we still had U.S. presence there. We had gunships there, and we had the 10th Mountain there. They began to execute and prosecute missions to track Aidid down, find him, and capture him. They had been unsuccessful through the middle of the summer of 93. And so what that ended up doing was setting up kind of an escalation of violence that took place as the U.S. would try to obtain Aidid and his clan members. Aidid would respond with command-detonated mines, and it was kind of a tit-for-tat kind of an arrangement and an escalation of violence. Finally, in about August, the beginning of August, end of July, Task Force Ranger was formed. They brought together a team of teams, if you will, to go after Aidid and do some manhunting. The teams consisted of a Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the 160th, 1st of the 160th, a element from the Rangers, 3rd of the 75th. There was a minus a company, so it was a slightly cut down one. A Special Forces unit, and an Air Force organization, the one I belong to, as well as an element of SEALs. So that formed Task Force Ranger. While we were still back in CONUS, we did a number of rehearsals for the various different types of events we thought we might have to encounter in going through this manhunting process. We did dynamic vehicle takedowns. We did static takedowns of buildings in numerous urban environments. So we tried to get our TTPs, develop our TTPs that we felt were suitable and effective or would be suitable and effective in that environment as we went forward.
So Task Force Ranger leadership requested armored vehicles and gunship support. When that request was denied, did that change your tactics going into the country?
That was a difficult thing. Prior to going in, like I said, we had rehearsed a number of different potential scenarios. Once we determined that those resources and assets were not going to be available, we did alter some of our tactics, techniques, and procedures. It was disappointing, but at the end of the day, General Garrison, the commanding general, assumed risk, felt like what we had was we were able to do the mission and would be able to complete the mission.
Task Force Ranger accomplished 6 missions prior to 3 October. Can you describe those missions, the success of those missions, and did the mission on 3 October feel any different going in?
So we arrived in Somalia at the end of August, around the 22nd, 23rd, I think it was. We were greeted by a couple mortar rounds coming into the airfield there, where we were holed up in an old Russian hangar there. And directly after that, as a response to that, to show Adid and his clan, the Somali National Alliance as well, that we meant to do business, we mounted up directly after that. We got our first target from the UN, and we executed that. That was number 1. It ended up being a dry hole. As the month went on, intel on Adid was slim. He had gone underground, if you will. So it was determined by the UN that our target list would expand then, and we would begin to look at taking down his what we call tier 2 elements and his infrastructure to try and force him to come up above ground so that we could get additional intelligence on him, actionable intelligence to take him down. There were, in addition to the first one, there were 5 other missions. They were a combination of 3-day, 3-night missions. There were varying degrees of success throughout those missions. Some happened to be dry holes that we ended up going to. Others, we did see some success of some lower level lieutenants. And one that was very successful, number 6, which was for Adid's finance minister, kind of held the purse strings, was the gun runner and supplier Osmanado. If you remember, if you've seen the movie, Osmanado is in there. He's in a connex or in a building, and he's sipping tea and he's smoking a cigar and he's talking to General Garrison. And General Garrison says, "Well, I hope you enjoy that tea." Well, I will tell you, the last time I saw Osmanado, he wasn't drinking tea and he wasn't smoking a cigar. In fact, he was handcuffed in a connex that we had that we were holding him in, and from there we turned him over to the UN for their list there. But significantly enough, in my mind, number 6 was probably our biggest takedown as far as his infrastructure, but the most significant one that we should have paid attention to, in my mind, was mission number 5. It again was for Osmanado, but it was in a static location. He had a business that did auto mechanics repair, that kind of thing. So we called it Otto's Garage. It was a daylight mission. It was it was a ground infill and an air infill simultaneously. And so as the assaulters went in to take the building down, there was we were unable to get a hold of him. We missed him. But one of the things that we did notice that day, and in my role, by the way, let me just kind of qualify this here. As a member of the CSAR team, the Combat Search and Rescue team, our job was to kind of sit in an orbit, in an off orbit, while we did these various different assault operations to be prepared in case anything happened, one of the assault aircraft went down or anything like that, we would respond to that particular incident. In an orbit with us was the C-2 bird, doing overwatch and providing command and control, coordination and communication for the teams on the ground. So as we're sitting in this orbit, this off orbit up there, and we're watching the target area and we're circling around, we see the MH6 and AH6 little birds flying around the area, the MH60s that we had, which were the assault aircraft. We began to notice a lot of airburst RPGs taking place. We had not seen this on any of the other missions that we had been on. And in addition to this, prior to that mission, the 10th Mountain, who was flying there, they did an operation called Eyes Over Moog. So at night, they would go and they would fly reconnaissance over Somalia, over Mogadishu. They also did some PSYOPs broadcast type of things. And one of their aircraft had been hit by an RPG and taken down as well. While we all acknowledged those things, I don't think we really paid attention to it. And it came back to bite us in the butt later on. And I say that because one of the tactics, techniques, and procedures that we used was to, as we would come into an area, we would assault a location. As that happened, usually we had surprise going on when we came in, but as the assault took place, crowds began to gather. And so what we had witnessed from films prior to deploying was generally it took approximately 35 to 45 minutes for these crowds to start to gather in any sort of significant manner. So as part of our operation, our intent was to go in and be in a target site and be out of there within 30 minutes prior to, or to try to minimize exposure and potential problems with large crowds. That being said, we still ran into the large crowds. Sometimes they formulated a little quicker than what we'd anticipated. And so one of the tactics, techniques, and procedures that we used was to bring the Blackhawks into a lower orbit and then begin to use the rotor wash to blow the crowds back. It was a very stinging rotor wash, and our thought process was, as if you're there still when the rotor wash is complete, you must be there to play. So we had a large concern for non-combatants mixed in with combatants, and it was a very curious situation there, something I had never seen before and really didn't understand. As these firefights or assaults would take place and they would begin to escalate, crowds of people, like I said, would gather, and everybody brought a gun. It was kind of like a carnival atmosphere. And it was, like I said, we had concern for non-combatants in there because there were multitudes of non-combatants mixed in with the Somali fighters. So anyhow, that was a tactic, technique, and procedure that we used to try to separate the players from the non-combatants. And as it would come into play on the 3-4 October mission, our number 7 mission, that's where that kind of came back and bit us in the butt.
Sir, would you mind describing the objectives for the mission on 3 October?
It was a Sunday. We began to get intelligence feeds coming in that there would be a meeting at a large building, a 2 or 3 story building adjacent to the Olympic Hotel in the Bakar market area. There were supposed to be 2 principals there. Salad and Awali were their last names. They were in his Tier 2, they were in Adid's Tier 2 list. And potentially there was also secondary information coming in that perhaps even Adid might be there. This particular location happened to be adjacent to the Bakar market area, which was the It was like an arms bazaar, if you will. It's a place where weapons of all sorts were sold. I watched a documentary one time, and afterwards, and there was an individual there that said, and if you had enough gas, you could even buy a tank there. Now, I never saw a tank there, but there were multiple types of weapons, lots of ammunition. This also happened to be right adjacent to or in the Aber Geder clan's district, so this was Adid's home territory. And Mogadishu was kind of broken up, kind of like the south side of Chicago during the Roaring 20s. There were different clans within the city. Different clans held different sectors of the city. And this particular area happened to be Adid's stronghold. So with that foreknowledge, as information continued to come in, they brought the team and the planners together, and they looked at a strategy to determine if this was going to be possible to execute this mission. Everybody was aware of the conditions, the potential risk involved, and knew that we were not only going into Adid's stronghold, but we were going into his backyard, into his living room. So there was some more study that was done, and ultimately the decision was made that we felt like our tactics, techniques, and procedures had been successful up to that point, in and out in no more than 30 minutes. The team felt like they could do it in no more than 30 minutes, and so General Garrison gave permission to go ahead and execute the mission. It was going to be a two-pronged attack. There was going to be an initial infill with MH6 Little Birds. So if you recall from the video, there's a piece of footage there that shows a building with some Little Birds coming in, one or two making a turn. That is actual footage from the assault and the Little Birds coming in to set in the initial assault element. There were 4 assaulters sitting on each Little Bird on the skids on those Little Birds, went in, dropped them off to make it more dynamic, get in, do the initial takedown. That was subsequently going to be followed by 4 Black Hawk helicopters that would follow in directly as the dust settled down. That was to put Ranger elements and blocking positions to cordon off the Olympic Hotel and that particular building. To follow that up, there was supposed to be a 12 vehicle convoy coming in after the initial takedown took place, and that would add additional individuals, additional security elements to cordon off the area, as well as then transport the detainees that were taken down at the site into transport vehicles, and the exfil then was going to be completely by ground vehicle operation. So that was kind of the scenario that was set up. Again, there was a level of confidence, but certainly an awareness of the significant threat that we were going to potentially face in that area.
Yes, sir. And whenever you found out that Super 6-1 had been shot down, can you describe the situation on your helicopter and what was going through your mind?
Well, just prior to that, let me just add a couple things here. As they went in, they did the takedown. The takedown went like clockwork. The 2 principals were there, Salad and Awali. In addition to that, there were about 20 other individuals there. They detained all of those individuals. They marshaled them. The cordon held. They pulled up the ground convoy. The rest of the security went out. They started loading the detainees in the vehicles and began to collapse the perimeter. The crowds at that point had increased significantly. The amount of fire had also begun to pick up. And this was happening a little bit quicker than we had ever seen it before as well. So again, going back to TTPs that we had used previously, we had snipers on some of those helicopters that came in to blow the crowds back. And the first one of those, Super 6-1 and 6-2, in fact, were in the pattern to do that. 6-1 had dropped down and was trying to push the crowds back. And as he came out of his effort there and began to pull away, 6-2 was coming in. 6-1 ended up taking an RPG to the tail rotor and lost tail rotor and lost control of the aircraft and began to spin out of control and ended up crashing about 6 blocks away. So hearing that call, actually we in the CSAR bird, I didn't hear it. I was not up comms. The team leader was up comms. We began to prepare ourselves to go in for an infill to service that particular crash site, because that is exactly what we were designed to do. A small QRF and a crash element to go in, secure the crash site, extract the wounded from the crash site, hold that site until the other ground convoy elements could then break from the original location and get to our location, pick us up, and then extract us out. So that was the plan going in. On the CSAR bird, there was 2 pararescuemen, myself, Scott Fales. We had a combat controller, Pat Rogers. We had an 18 Delta SF medic in there with us as well to provide additional medical capability. And then we had 11 individuals for security. So it was a combination of Rangers and SF security elements in there with us, 15 of us tightened in there. And I was sitting in the middle of the 2 gunner seats in the 60. And if you're familiar with the back of a 60, trying to get 15 individuals in a 60, it's extraordinarily tight. And to that, because of that, we had choreographed and we had worked through getting out of the aircraft, both if we did an air-land or if we had to do a fast rope out there. So there was a specified sequence of events of who was going to go out first, second, third, who was going to, before that, kick the ropes, then that sequence would start. We also had additional medical bags in there and bags of litters in there in A3 kit bags, and certain individuals were tasked to kick those out when this event and this sequence of events started. So I'm sitting there between these 2 gunner seats. My good friend and team leader, Scott Fales, is sitting across from me. As we start the process, we're kind of moving and trying to get situational awareness of where the crash site is. As the video said, it was about 8 minutes and 35 seconds after the initial call went out that we made our infill. Something I'd like to throw out there that's not recognized in that is that in that 8 minutes and 35 seconds, as Super 6-1 is laying in a small alleyway, unlike the movie, it did not crash in a large intersection and a very dynamic slide. It came to rest after hitting a wall with its right wheel flipped over on its left side and was in an alleyway in a confined area. Passage between the belly of the helo and the next wall was about the size of this stage up here, so a very, very confined space. There were survivors of that, and as the survivors are getting out of that aircraft and trying to orient themselves, this is what is taking place during that 8 minutes and 35 seconds. There is a MH6 Little Bird that, on his own initiative, has watched this, comes in, lands in the middle of the street adjacent to that alleyway. There is minimal rotor distance or rotor clearance for that little bird between the buildings in that road adjacent to the alleyway there. The pilot continues to maintain control of the aircraft. He's holding the stick. He's got his MP5K model out. He's shooting targets as they're coming at him down range. The co-pilot gets out of the aircraft, goes and collects 2 of the individuals who had managed to crawl out of the aircraft, puts them on the skids, ties them in, and they're able to depart that area with 2 survivors of that. So we did not know that was going on, but having watched the footage of that, enormous cojones and just, and it also goes to show for airmanship skills. This was a very confined space, These individuals put this light aircraft in there, held it. It was on a slight uphill grade that they were looking at, and then was able to get out of there again in very confined space. So that had taken place, like I said, during that 8 minutes and 35 seconds. As we're moving up and down and around, I'm looking at Scott, Scott's looking at me, and we kind of acknowledge to each other, well, this is what we've trained all our adult professional careers for. And so, and to that, in this role as a pararescueman and doing combat search and rescue, you always want to do your job. You want to be there to help. But when you get to do your job, that means something's gone really crappy for somebody else. But at the end of the day, bad things happen to good people, and that's why we're there, is to be able to execute that option if it's needed. So we start to go in, we come around, we find the helo, we pass once by to try and get a look at it, get situational awareness of the crash site, get some orientation. Again, I couldn't see anything. I'm sitting between two gunner seats, but I'm looking and trying to get cues from the other people in the aircraft. We pull into a hover, we start to slide forward, ropes, the command is given, we kick the ropes out, and we start the exfil process. So our job at this point is to get out of the damn aircraft as rapidly as possible, because in that position, in that hover over the crash site, the aircraft is extraordinarily vulnerable. While we're doing that, and in that 8 minutes and 35 seconds, like I said, I'm backtracking a little bit. The helo lands. Simultaneous to that, there is elements from the original target takedown, combination of SF and Rangers that are given guidance to start moving to the crash site. So as it turns out, as we're fast roping in, there are some small elements that had come on foot that are arriving at the crash site about the same time we're starting that infill. As we infill, like I said, we kick out the ropes. Everybody moves according to plan. Things that one of the young Rangers had forgotten, though, was his task to kick out some of the medical bags. Myself and Scott Fales were the last two out of the aircraft. He was on the right side. I was going out the left. I kicked out the medical bags. He kicked them out on his side, and we're going down on the ropes. Hit the ground. It's brownout conditions. I can't see anything. I'm disoriented. I really don't have a clue as to where the crash site is. But one of the things that took place while we were infilling I was absolutely unaware of, but again, having watched footage after the event, was as we are coming in, we flare, we pitch out the ropes, we start the fast rope in. There is gunfire, there's small arms fire. I'm not aware of that. We can't hear that, but there's also some RPG fire. And as we come to find out later, as we're in the hover, and probably while we were taking the extra time to kick the bags out, sliding down the ropes, Super 6-8, our aircraft, takes an RPG to the main rotor system. The shrapnel from that blew down into the back side of the Black Hawk, where the oil cooler system is on the back trailing edge of that there. And watching the footage, the aircraft starts to transition to forward flight, but then settles back into a hover. Well, it just so happens that there were still ropes, two individuals on the ropes, and that happened to be Scott and I. So instead of slinging our butts down the street to save the aircraft like he probably had every right to do, rolled it back into a hover until we got off the ropes. They cut the ropes, and then they flew the aircraft back to the airfield. On the way back, because of the damage, they lost all oil pressure in the engine. Basically made it back just to the airfield, did a controlled crash landing back at the airfield. And then that entire crew got out of that aircraft, got into the single spare that we had, went out over the ocean, test fired the miniguns, and got right back in the pattern to help contribute. So again, airmanship skills, and every time I see Dan Gelata, who was at the stick that time, I thank him for not slinging my sorry butt down the streets. And fortunately, I've had a number of different opportunities to do that, so it's always a pleasure for me to remind him of that. Dan, by the way, just retired here last month, CW5, an extraordinary aviator, and has flown an enormous number of aircraft in a number of different roles and responsibilities for the Air Force. I mean, for the Army, excuse me. He'd shoot me for saying that. So anyhow, getting in, that's kind of the scenario getting in. Did I miss anything?
No, you're good, sir.
Okay.
So shortly after insertion, your team lead, Sergeant Fales, got hit in the leg. Can you describe how that changed the dynamic and the situation on the ground from then on?
Well, like I said, getting in, there was brownout conditions. Couldn't see anything. The dust begins to clear a little bit and settle. I don't know where I'm at. I begin to hear some snap, crackle, pops around me and over my head, and I'm trying to orient myself. I managed to catch a glimpse of some uniforms going around the corner in an alleyway. It's about, I don't know, probably about 30, 40 meters away from me. So I immediately grabbed my kit, grabbed the kit bags that we had thrown out in the middle of the street, start to make my way for that location. One of the method that we had here, or that we had practiced frequently, was as we went in, we would establish a perimeter around the crash site. We would begin to set up a casualty collection point at some significant area. We had designated usually the tail of the aircraft as that point, and some place that had access, so that if we had an exfil, it would be readily available and easy access to move the wounded that we had triaged and that we had on litters into vehicles to get them out of there. So as I came around the corner of this alleyway here, I found Super 6-1 laying on its left side there. It was down the alleyway a little bit, but the tail boom and the stabilator were there near the entrance of it, and the rest of the team had already begun to do what they were supposed to do. They began to set up a perimeter. Now, because we were in an alleyway, we didn't have to really defend and could not defend all 4 o'clock positions. We had basically the 12 o'clock and the 6 o'clock there at the tail boom, but we really weren't able to secure the buildings and the areas next to us. And that became a little significant as time went on. But my duty at that time, I knew Scott was already going in to do the initial assessment of the aircraft and of the crew to determine accountability, assessment of any injuries, etc. I began to set up a casualty collection point at the tail of the aircraft, got the litters out, got those set up so that we could rapidly, again, any injured that we had, put them on the litters, be ready to move them out. So after I'd gotten that done, I started to make my way around the belly of the aircraft to go in and provide some assistance to Bob Mabry, the 18 Delta that we had, and Scott Fales, who I assumed at that point were already in the crash site and starting to work on the injured. As I rounded the corner of the belly of the aircraft there and came into the broader part of the alleyway there, I saw one of the Rangers helping Scott. He was kind of hobbling back, and I said, "Well, what the hell happened to you?" And he said, "I got shot." I said, "You got shot?" He said, "Yeah, the rat bastards shot me." And so, you know, Scott says he didn't say that, but I say he did, and this is my story. And besides, any of you who happen to know Scott, know even if he didn't say it, he probably would have said it. So at that point, Scott did not have, he was non-ambulatory. We moved him back to the back of the aircraft. So he began to do the next best thing that he could do, and that was help secure the crash site. And he was really perturbed at that point. And Scott is also very good with a rifle, and so he began to give some payback there for the injury he was feeling. I proceeded ahead, went into the aircraft. I crawled over the top. I also managed to get see one of the other survivors of the crash site coming back out, and had talked with him, and he told me that the pilot and the co-pilot, unfortunately, were still in the aircraft, and that they were both deceased. So I I went ahead though, went in, got into the cockpit, crawled down over, leaned down into it, checked them, and in fact they were both deceased. As I was starting to go back over the top and move around a little bit, my next task was going to be to see if I could get them out. We were able to get one of the pilots out of the top and get him over the top, take him back to the casualty collection point. Went back to see if I could help get the other pilot out. I decided to go in through the cabin area to see if there was a way to get the seat to fold back to try and slide him out. He was on the bottom on the left side, and as it turned out, on impact, when 6-1 hit the wall and then rolled over, it hit nose first, and so it pushed the nose back, and it pushed all of the instrument panels and everything like that down onto his lap. When it did that, it collapsed the seat as well, and the individual was pinned in there. So again, thinking maybe I could get him out from the backside, I started looking over the edge and trying to figure out how I was going to get down there. I managed to see a little bit of a flight glove and a little bit of a desert cami uniform sticking out of some rubble down in the bottom. I called out and was inquiring, hey, anybody down there, anybody? And the fingers on the glove started to move. So what we didn't realize, even though we had tried to get accountability, and we also did not realize that the two individuals had been pulled out by the little bird, that there was still an individual left in the helicopter, not just the pilot who was trapped in the front. So with that, got down there, was able to pull the gunner crew chief out of the left side, who now had been trapped in the seat down there, and all of the equipment and everything had fallen over on him. We were able to get him out of there. Also, Bob Mabry, the 18 Delta, had crawled in there with me, so we were pulling him out of there. Got him stood up, and about that time we got hit with a hail of bullets that came through the cabin area, and I liken it to kind of like one of those snow globes that you have, where you shake the globe and all the snow goes around and then it falls back down. That's about what it was like inside the cabin. So there weren't any direct rounds that I can recall coming through there, but there was a lot of secondary shrapnel from the cabin and the metal in there that was flying around in the area. As it turns out, the individual that we pulled out of there, the crew chief, had gotten hit. He lost part of a finger in that. Bob got hit in the hand and the upper arm pretty well as well. I got slapped in the face a little bit and caught a little bit in the arm. But I looked at Bob. I said, hey, am I okay? He said, yeah, you're fine. And as Monty Python would say, it was just a flesh wound. So we pressed on. I looked at the crew chief. He was looking at his finger and the blood pumping out of his finger, and I just kind of put my hand on it and said, okay, let's get you out of here. Instead of taking him over the top, we dug a hole in the bottom under the belly and decided to slide him out of there, and that's how we got him out of there. Bob went and took him out, took him back to the casualty collection point, and I proceeded to try and get the pilot and see if we could get him out of being pinned there in the front. As it turned out, that was not possible. I was unable to maneuver him in any way, so I decided to exfil back out and get back out to the casualty collection point. Bob Mabry had come back in since then and said, hey, why don't we drag these Kevlar floorboards out there with us that were on the bottom of the helo. We'll use those for a little bit of cover and concealment, and we'll see how they do. Thought that was a great idea. We did that, and so we used those at the back of the aircraft there, propped up against the stabilator for a little bit of cover protection, mostly for concealment. So that's kind of the dynamics. Scott was out of it. Everybody else, though, was doing their jobs. Scott was now doing his job. He had already applied his own bandage, took care of himself medically. So at that point, we were trying to figure out how much longer we were going to be there, when the ground convoy was going to get to us, and look at potential exfil. From there, it was a little while longer than we had anticipated. Ground convoy, unbeknownst to us, was having a terrible time making its way to us. They were getting shot up very badly in the streets. Command and control from the C-2 bird, trying to give them verbal directions to where we were located at over the radio was not working out real well. So as the ground convoy is driving through the streets, through basically a shooting gallery, command and control is talking to them. They're telling them where to turn. By the time the information is down to the lead vehicle, they've passed the turn. They're stopping, they're starting, they're stopping, they're starting, trying to make their way to us. A lot of chaos and very problematic. Again, it's one thing to go to a known position where you've looked at it on a map ahead of time, I think, and pre-plan that route and execute that route, which they did initially very well. It's another thing to go from a known location now to an absolutely unknown location and try to find your way there. There's no AAA maps of Somalia that you can lay out or of Mogadishu and follow the route. The streets aren't named or numbered, and the streets aren't like our streets here. A lot of them are just simply unimproved dirt pathways in between buildings, so it was very, very confusing. While that's happening, it's taking a long time. We do happen to see the ground convoy about 4 blocks up pass by an alleyway or an intersection up there. For me, that was the key. Okay, hey, they're on their way. They're going to be here shortly. And so I began to package folks up, make sure everybody was on litters so that when they did arrive, it would be a very expeditious exfil. We would just pick up the litters, throw them on the vehicles, everybody would pile in, and we'd get out of there. So to that, because Scott was injured, non-ambulatory, I said, hey, get on the litter. We'll tighten you down here. That way you're ready to go when they show up. And he had some protest to that. He was not real pleased about getting tied down to a litter, but he acquiesced, and we continued on for a few more minutes. And it became apparent that it was going to be a more lengthy time. I turned around and was treating some other patients. I turned back around. Scott had gotten himself out of the litter, was up again with his weapon and making rounds down range. As we were sitting there, we weren't just sitting there. As we were working on patients. He was putting rounds down range. There was a lot of small arms fire that was taking place. There was a lot of RPGs that were coming inbound, some of them in close proximity. One, in fact, we ended up looking up and seeing the guy pull the trigger on the RPG, and it was headed straight for us. Scott got off a couple rounds at him, but the RPG was on its way. It ended up hitting the ground in front of us, and we all looked at each other as this was happening. In your mind, it all goes in slow motion. And it's all happening very rapidly, but you're looking at each other, and the RPG's inbound. It hits, it skips, and it slides up in front of us and doesn't detonate. So God watches over fools. So as that's continuing, a lot of small arms fire, like I said. I talked about we were unable to secure the courtyards in the buildings next to us. As it turns out, the Somalis had come back in the courtyard adjacent to us, the wall there next to the rotor area of 6-1 that was laying there. And they had come in there. We had not seen them, and they began to toss grenades over the wall at us. I will tell you that they will take your breath away. Luckily, none of us got hit real bad. The first one that came over, Pat Rogers, our combat controller, caught some shrapnel in the back, though, but was okay. Another one came over, and we all watched it, and it was, again, in slow motion. You can see it flip and come over and land. Saw a second one come over and land, and everybody just kind of went, nothing went off. Thank God for 4 quality control on Russian munitions. And also, I think the Somalis were a little excited as well. On one of them, they hadn't pulled the pin on it. So we pulled the pin and obliged backwards. And we didn't hear any more over that side for a little while. So one of the things that is kind of odd is the type of humor, I think, that takes place in those situations. And there was humor at the back of the aircraft. And even with the amount of gunfire, and if you've ever laid next to a weapon on semi-auto, full auto, we had 60s, we had saws going as well. It is absolutely deafening, but the mind is a wonderful thing. And as all of that's happening, it becomes white noise, and you can have a conversation between the two of you here, and your brain is able to parse that out somehow. And so as we're sitting there, and Scott's putting more rounds down range, I'm trying to find some targets. These holes are opening up in the stabilator next to us, and the Kevlar boards that we have propped up in front of us are getting knocked down. I put them back up, they get knocked down. I put them back up, they get knocked down. And these holes start opening up in the stabilator, like I said. And all I could think of at the time was the movie The Jerk. And so I know that's a long time ago for you folks, but there's a scene in there where he's working at the gas station and he's got these oil cans next to him, and this maniac is up in the hill and he's trying to kill him and he's trying to shoot him with a sniper rifle. And he keeps missing him, and the cans keep opening up, these oil cans getting holes in them, and the oil's flowing all over. So I'm looking at the holes in the stabilator, I'm thinking of the movie, and I use Steve Martin's line in there, "They hate the cans, stay away from the cans." I don't know why, it just came to me, and out it came. And so Scott stops and he looks at me, and then he just starts laughing, and we both laugh. So, like I said, it's odd. Maybe it's just me, maybe I'm just odd. But at any rate, that continues. The ground convoy is still not getting to us. One of my close friends and teammates, Dan Schilling, is combat controller on the ground convoy. He is Danny McKnight's kind of air-to-ground guy there in the lead vehicle. Danny is Colonel McKnight is the ground convoy commander there. And Dano relayed to me later that they are getting the living hell shot out of them out in the streets. And in fact, again, the command and control and the coordination there, trying to move this, they're getting directions to us. It's getting confused. They can't get to us. Then command and control is giving them directions to another crash site. So unbeknownst to us, I'm dealing with Super 6-8 in crash site 1. Another crash had taken place. Super 6-4 had come in to fill in Super 6-1's role. They ended up getting hit by an RPG as well, tried to make their way back to the airfield, and ended up crash landing between the original target site and the airfield. And that was, in fact, Mike Durant's aircraft, him, his co-pilot, and the two crew chiefs on board. So where we are at right now is that we have a ground convoy that is getting the hell shot out of them, trying to get to the two crash sites. We have crash site 1 and we have crash site 2. In fact, at this point in time, Task Force Ranger is task saturated, and we have no more resources to be able to apply to crash site 2. We're trying to hold our own here. Crash site, or the ground convoy, has taken so many casualties that they are told to make their way back to the airfield, and justifiably so, and that's the only way they ended up saving themselves as well. During this process, I hear a call for that they need medical attention across the street. As I said earlier, some of those elements from the Olympic Hotel had fought their way back over to our crash site area there, and there were small elements there. One of the elements was a kitty corner up the street and holed up in a little courtyard up there and had taken some significant injuries. And so with that, I looked around. It's obvious that they needed medical attention. Mabry is working on some folks over here. Scott's not ambulatory, and so it's my turn at bat. So I grabbed my medical bag, headed to the corner, looked at the situation, and I looked over at Scott and I said, "Cover me." And Scott looked up at me and began to laugh. He said, "Yeah, sure, go ahead." And we've got small arms fire coming from a number of different directions, and it was really just the stupidest thing to say. But that's what they say in the movies. So with that, I made a break and made my way over to the courtyard and got inside. And indeed, they did have some significantly wounded individuals. One of the individuals in particular, one of the Ranger privates, had been hit in the left buttocks there with an exit wound in the medial thigh, and was bleeding profusely at the time. So I went to work on him. There were some other individuals there that were also injured. Got him basically stabilized, and IVs started, took care of the other folks as well. And that was kind of the initial onslaught of all of that.
Well, sir, unfortunately, we're getting towards the end of our interview time. Do you mind commenting on getting back to base and the situation whenever you finally did get back to your home base?
Sure. So, night comes. Convoy can't get to us. We know they're coming. Radio communications telling us they're putting a QRF together, and they're sending the ground convoy out to get us. Every time we hear that call, they said they'll be there in about 30 minutes, at a process where we're at about 5 hours later. They tell us they'll be there in 30 minutes. We all just looked at each other and laughed and said, check, we got it. But they in fact did, and they put a ground convoy together made up of what was left of Task Force Ranger back at the airfield, some 10th Mountain elements, some Pakistanis, and some Malaysians. And the force came back out for us. And in fact, you could hear it coming out through the city. You could hear the firefight getting closer and closer and closer as they fought their way to us and got to our location. With them, as they came in and encapsulated our area with the 10th Mountain folks, they brought in Malaysian BTRs, or armored personnel carriers there, and we began to load the wounded at our different locations into these BTRs. We were there as we got folks loaded. I assumed that immediately after we got folks loaded, the wounded in there, we were going to go ahead and exfil the area, but we stayed there. We were there longer than I had anticipated. I did not know until after why, and it was we were trying to get Cliff Walcott's body out of 6-1, and it was a very difficult situation. They ended up getting his body out of 6-1 finally through a lot of different efforts, and then we were able to depart. Sun was rising. With that, the increase of RPGs, it picked up, and the BTR that I was in with my wounded began to rock and roll a little bit, but finally we began to move. And so as we began to move in exfil, we'd roll up to intersections, and it felt like we'd stop. I'd hear the turret gunner kick off, and he'd start spraying down some rounds, and I'm thinking, what the hell is going on here? Why are we stopping? And so I've got my wounded in there, and one of the little portholes that's there, I'm peeking out the porthole, and I see uniforms going by. And I'm thinking, what the heck are those guys doing out there? I had just assumed, like so many things that happened that night, and I got it wrong, that we had enough vehicles to exfil everybody on vehicles. That, in fact, was not the case. So we were able to get the wounded in the vehicles, and then the rest of the guys had to fight their way out to a Pakistani checkpoint that was a strong point there. I felt terrible. I'm sitting in this BTR, and the rest of my teammates are out there on the street fighting their way, doing leapfrog operations between intersections, which was why the BTR stopped, and then would fire up the intersection and provide cover fire for it. When we finally got out to the checkpoints, though, everybody was able to get in vehicles, and we were able to make our way to safe locations. The vast majority of us went to what was called the Pakistani Stadium. It was a stadium, a huge soccer stadium that was kind of a stronghold for the Pakistanis. Some other folks went to the Newport area, which was an area there in Mogadishu near the port, as it indicates, that was held by a non-adversarial clan and had its way mechanisms to get back to the airport then. So at that location, that's at the Pakistani Stadium, that's where we ended up doing a huge triage, a mass casualty with the injured that we had. and tried to determine accountability throughout the task force and determine who was missing, who we had. We started bringing in helicopters to the Pakistani stadium in exfil and our wounded to the UN compound.
One last question that I have to ask. Casting for the movie, how did you feel about being cast by what we commonly know as Phil Dunphy from Modern Family?
So when I heard they were making the movie and the casting was taking place, and some of my buddies said, "Hey, there's a guy by the name of Ty Burrell playing your part." I'd never heard of Ty Burrell, nor had really any of the other folks. So I got on the computer, and yes, we had computers even back then. And so I searched the internet, and I pulled up Ty Burrell, and I'm looking, and he is a classical theatrical actor, trained, and there's a picture of him doing Shakespeare in tights. And I looked at it, and unfortunately, my teammates were looking over my shoulder, and they looked at that and they said, "Oh yeah, that's the guy for you, brother." And so that has stuck with me longer than I would appreciate. So.
Sir, any last words for the class of AY-16?
And thanks for bringing that up, Ryan. I appreciate it. Yeah, just some real quick thoughts from my perspective, and you have to realize I am biased in my perspective, having gone through that. And after the mission, a lot of it, there was a lot of controversy about it. It was portrayed in many media areas as a debacle, as a failure. And I would submit to you from the seats I sat in that it was not a failure. And in fact, we accomplished the initial mission that we went in to accomplish. We obtained 22 detainees, 2 principals. We turned them over ultimately to UN authorities. We had a secondary situation that took place where we lost an aircraft. And our mission was to respond to that, and we did so. We went into crash site 1. We were able to pull out of the 8 people on board. We were able to pull 4 of those individuals off, the 2 that died on impact. We also recovered them. We were able to return all of those folks. So from that aspect, it was a successful mission from my optic. If you want to play numbers, and I'm not big on playing numbers, but we lost 18 individuals that day. We had approximately another 73 or 75 wounded, so it was about 100 of us. Our adversaries, depending on what statistics you look at, lost between 300 and 800 individuals. So I would say that Task Force Ranger gave itself a relatively good accounting out in the streets that day, although that's not something that I think is a way to account for success. Some other things that I would throw out there is that throughout all this process, one of the things that saved us was teamwork, and teamwork was everywhere. Guys were looking out for each other on the left and the right of them. People took care of each other. I relate a couple, instances of a very bold and dynamic teamwork with the aircraft coming in. And I will tell you, throughout the night, the only thing that kept us alive out in those little pockets where we were at were the AH-6 little birds coming in and doing strafing runs and rocket runs to secure our positions. While they were doing that, as they'd Winchester, they'd go back to the airfield, have to rearm, refit, refuel. The 60s were up patrolling. Everybody was doing that. The folks in the back who were doing the maintenance on the aircraft, rearming and refitting, feeding them with sandwiches and coffee, kept us alive. The folks that came out to get us in the QRF, that combined team that came out there. So teamwork was everywhere, and it's what really saved us. One of the other things I like to kind of try and throw out there is that, for many of us, we choose MOSs, AFSCs, rates, and vocations or specialties here that are combat arms, where we choose to be X and we work hard to get on the X. But not everybody's job does that. But I would submit to you that regardless of whether you're in the group that's on the X or those providing capability to get people to the X or support those on the X, that it's all essential. And so I tell folks often, I said, never measure, the importance and the impact of what you do by your proximity to the tip of that spear, because it takes everybody along the shaft of that spear pushing the spear, doing their part in the dance to get the tip of that spear to the target. So, it was us out there that day, but it was everybody out there working to help save us that day as well. So I just offer those kind of thoughts up.
Well, sir, I think knowing that somebody's coming after us and that nobody's going to be left behind is a big part of the American military ethos. So I just wanted to thank you and the men and women of personnel recovery for what they do. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Master Sergeant Wilkinson.
Thank you very much.